They called him Britain's Elvis, the boy from India who came to England with nothing but a dream and ended up rewriting the history of British pop. Cliff Richard was more than a singer, he was a phenomenon. The first homegrown rock star, the man who sold millions before the Beatles even picked up guitars. He was supposed to be untouchable, and for decades he was. But behind the dazzling smile and wholesome charm lay a story that even his most loyal fans didn't fully know. A story of heartbreak, faith, reinvention, betrayal, and public humiliation. Cliff Richard's life is one of the greatest roller coasters in the history of music. How does a man go from filling Wembley Stadium to sitting alone, afraid to step outside his house? How does someone who never committed a crime end up being treated like one on live television? And why did Cliff Richard vanish from the spotlight when he should have been enjoying his legacy? This isn't just the tale of a pop star. It's the story of resilience in the face of unimaginable pressure. It's the story of a man who was first crowned Britain's teenage idol, then crucified by the very industry and media that built him up. Today, we'll dive deep into Cliff Richard's extraordinary journey, the rise, the heartbreaks, the scandals, and the shocking raid that nearly destroyed him. Because sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought on stage, but in silence, when the spotlight fades. On October 14, 1940, while bombs thundered across Europe and Britain braced for invasion, a baby was born thousands of miles away in Lucknow, British India. His name was Harry Roger Webb, the boy who would one day become Cliff Richard. At first glance, nothing about his beginnings suggested destiny. His father, Roger, worked for the British colonial system. His mother, Dorothy, tried to give their children stability in a world spinning out of control, but the ground under their feet was already shifting. India was restless. The independence movement was gaining force, and the empire that had stood for centuries was beginning to crack. By 1946, riots had erupted on Direct Action Day, unleashing violence so severe that entire British families suddenly realized they were no longer safe. The Webbs were among them. In 1948, with India pulling free of colonial rule, the family packed their lives into battered suitcases and left the only home they had ever known. They didn't fly first class. They didn't even leave on a sleek liner. Instead, they boarded the SS Ranchi, a ship filled with hundreds of anxious families who understood that their era in India had ended. For 3 long weeks, they crossed the Indian Ocean. The voyage wasn't glamorous, it was survival. Children cried, families huddled close, unsure of the cold, gray island awaiting them. For young Harry, it was the first time life revealed itself as fragile. The first time he understood that comfort could vanish overnight. When the ship docked in England, the contrast was brutal. Gone was the heat and color of India. In its place, rationing, damp air, and post-war austerity. The Webbs settled into a modest house in Cheshire, Hertfordshire. The rooms were smaller, the skies darker, and the food plainer. For a boy who had once played in sunlit courtyards, the shift was harsh. Yet, it toughened him. Harry wasn't from a wealthy background anymore. He was just another immigrant kid trying to fit into a Britain still recovering from bombs and loss. School wasn't easy. His accent marked him out. The sudden downgrade in lifestyle left him restless. But inside Harry, a hunger was growing. That voyage across oceans had planted something permanent. The belief that he needed to prove himself, to make something bigger out of life. Music became his escape. He listened to records whenever he could, studying the sound of American rock and roll drifting across the Atlantic. But destiny didn't announce itself all at once. At home, he was still Harry Webb, shy, lanky, unsure. The confidence that would later define Cliff Richard didn't exist yet. What did exist was a need to rise above the gray skies, to find a voice loud enough to drown out the silence of post-war Britain. And soon fate intervened. By his teenage years, Harry discovered not only that he could sing, but that he could make others stop and listen. Teachers noticed. Friends pushed him to try more. Slowly, the immigrant boy from Lucknow was beginning to believe he had something special. Still, at that point, nothing was guaranteed. Britain had no real rock and roll stars of its own. American imports like Elvis Presley ruled the charts. British performers, when they existed at all, were pale imitations. For a boy dreaming of making it in music, the odds were nearly impossible. But Harry Webb had already learned something on that long journey from India. Survival meant defying odds. And so, step by step, the boy who had left India began disappearing. In his place, a new figure was being born. The world didn't know it yet, but the seeds of Britain's first rock star had already been planted. All it needed was a name, a sound, and the right moment to erupt. By the mid-1950s, Harry Webb was just another teenager in a drab England, still rationing sugar and struggling with the scars of war. But when American records slipped into the country, Chuck Berry, Buddy Holly, and above all, Elvis Presley, something inside him caught fire. These weren't polite ballroom numbers. They were raw, dangerous, alive. Harry wanted that sound. He wanted that rebellion. But there was a problem. No one in Britain was doing it. The UK charts were filled with crooners, novelty songs, and ballads designed for parents, not their restless kids. British teenagers had no star to call their own. If Harry could step into that gap, he could become something far bigger than just a singer. He could become a movement. Enter Harry Greatrix, a manager with an eye for trends. He saw potential in Webb's voice, but knew the name wouldn't work. Harry Webb, he said, doesn't sound like a star. You need something sharp, something strong, something that sounds like rock together, they brainstormed. The answer came in two pieces. First, Cliff, solid, British, immovable, like a cliff face. Second, Richard, chosen as a tribute to the flamboyant American rocker, Little Richard. Harry Webb disappeared. Cliff Richard was born. The transformation wasn't just cosmetic. Cliff began rehearsing with a local skiffle group that would evolve into the Drifters, later renamed the Shadows to avoid clashing with the American band of the same name. Their rehearsals were electric. Unlike the polished acts on British television, Cliff and his band sweated, shouted, and played like they had something to prove. And they did. They were inventing British rock on the fly. Then came the moment that changed everything. On August 29th, 1958, Columbia Records released a song called Move It. Written by Ian Samwell and recorded in a rush, it wasn't polished. It was urgent. Cliff was only 18, his voice still rough around the edges, but the energy was undeniable. The opening riff snarled through radios, and suddenly Britain sounded different. For the first time, teenagers in the UK didn't have to look across the Atlantic. They had their own star, their own anthem. Music critics later said it outright. Before Move It, there was nothing in England worth listening to. After Move It, the door blew open. The song shot to #2 on the UK charts, a staggering achievement for an unknown teenager. But the real impact couldn't be measured in numbers. It was in the chaos that followed. On tour, Cliff faced scenes Britain had never seen before. Girls screamed, cried, even fainted. Boys hated him, resenting the way he pulled attention away. Security guards couldn't hold the crowds back. Newspapers called it Cliff hysteria. Suddenly, Britain had its own version of Elvis-level mania. The industry noticed too. Record labels rushed to sign acts that looked or sounded remotely similar. Television shows booked him instantly, knowing his name guaranteed ratings. In one dizzying year, Cliff went from an unknown immigrant kid to the face of a youth revolution. But Cliff himself wasn't entirely comfortable. He later admitted he wasn't naturally confident. The rock and roll swagger was, in his own words, an act. But it didn't matter. By the end of 1959, that act had become reality. Cliff Richard was a household name, and he wasn't slowing down. In 1959, he released Living Doll, a song he initially hated, calling it too soft, too fake. But after his band slowed it down into a country-style ballad, the single exploded. It hit #1, stayed there for 6 weeks, and sold nearly 800,000 copies. Cliff had his first gold record. By year's end, he had sold over 1 million records in Britain, something no one had ever done before. The shy boy from India had transformed into the nation's first rock superstar. And yet this was only the beginning. Because soon Hollywood would call, and Cliff Richard would prove he wasn't just a singer. He wanted to conquer the screen too. By 1959, Cliff Richard wasn't just Britain's first rock star. He was its first teenage idol. His records sold in the hundreds of thousands, and his concerts caused scenes of chaos. But Cliff didn't want to be just a singer. He wanted to be taken seriously as a performer, an entertainer who could cross boundaries. And when Hollywood came calling, he grabbed the chance. His first real break came in the film Serious Charge, 1959. It was no lighthearted teen flick. The movie tackled weighty themes, sexual scandal, false accusations, and moral corruption inside a church parish. For a 19-year-old pop idol, the decision was shocking. Cliff was expected to play it safe, churn out fluffy musicals and smile for screaming fans. Instead, he chose a script that pushed boundaries. He sang the title track, of course, but the bigger statement was clear. Cliff Richard wasn't going to be pigeonholed. The next year, he doubled down with Espresso Bongo, 1960, a satirical take on the music industry. The film mocked managers, promoters, and the very machine that had turned Cliff into a star. Once again, he showed he wasn't afraid to bite the hand that fed him. British critics raised their eyebrows, but teenagers kept filling theaters. To them, Cliff was more than a singer. He was an icon who looked just like them, spoke their language, and now appeared on the big screen. But it was Summer Holiday 1963 that made him a household name beyond music. The story of four young men driving a red double-decker bus across Europe to find love and freedom was pure escapism. Released at the dawn of the swinging 60s, it captured the optimism of a new generation. When the film premiered in London on January 10, 1963, chaos erupted. Over 3,000 fans swarmed Leicester Square, blocking traffic and trapping Cliff in his car. He missed his own premiere, but it didn't matter. The hype was unstoppable. The soundtrack album hit #1 before the film even opened nationwide, holding the top spot for 14 weeks straight. Songs like Bachelor Boy, The Next Time, and the title track Summer Holiday dominated the charts. Even an instrumental by The Shadows, Foot Tapper, hit #1. The film itself became the second biggest box office hit in Britain that year, just behind James Bond's From Russia with Love. Suddenly, Cliff Richard was not only Britain's biggest singer, but also its most bankable movie star. He even beat out actors in popularity polls, being named the UK's most popular film star of 1963. But no success in the 1960s could ignore one looming shadow: the Beatles. By the time Cliff was dominating theaters with Summer Holiday, John, Paul, George, and Ringo were exploding into Beatlemania. Most thought Cliff would fade into irrelevance overnight. Yet in 1964, at the height of Beatles hysteria, Cliff Richard released 6 top 10 hits. The Beatles managed only 5. Songs like Constantly on the Beach and I Could Easily Fall in Love with You kept Cliff firmly in the spotlight. At cinemas, his Summer Holiday clashed with A Hard Day's Night. Both broke records. The battle was real. Even the Beatles admitted his influence. Paul McCartney said that the Beatles went to Hamburg because Cliff had Britain sewn up. And John Lennon went further. Before Cliff Richard and Move It, there was nothing worth listening to in England. By the mid-1960s, Cliff Richard had done the impossible. He'd faced down the Beatles, conquered both the music charts and the box office, and proven himself more than just a pretty face. He was Britain's first true multimedia superstar, but fame came with choices. Would he keep chasing the rock and roll crown, or follow something far more personal, something that would shock his fans more than any movie role ever could? By the mid-1960s, Cliff Richard had survived what most thought impossible, holding his own against the Beatles, topping charts, and even ruling the box office. On the outside, he was untouchable, but behind the scenes, something deeper was stirring. Fame hadn't solved the restlessness inside him. It hadn't answered the question of who Cliff Richard really was once the lights dimmed and the fans went home. In June 1966, the world found out. At Earl's Court in London, Cliff walked out onto a stage not to sing, but to stand beside American evangelist Billy Graham. Before thousands and with cameras rolling, Cliff Richard declared that he had become a Christian. It wasn't a quiet admission in a magazine interview. It was a full public testimony in an era when rock stars were expected to rebel, not pray. The reaction was immediate. Fans were stunned. Some cried. Others were confused. The boy who had been marketed as Britain's Elvis had taken a turn no one expected. His management worried. The industry whispered, could a pop idol survive while talking about faith in the middle of the swinging 60s? The safe bet said no. Even Cliff wasn't sure. He considered walking away from music entirely. He thought maybe the stage and Christianity couldn't coexist. Some friends encouraged him to retrain as a teacher or missionary. For a while, he genuinely wrestled with the idea. His career was already legendary. Perhaps it was time to leave it behind. But then, something shifted. Cliff realized he didn't have to choose. He didn't need to drop his faith nor abandon his music. Instead, he could do what no one had done before, merge the two. He decided to stay in the spotlight, but this time with honesty. Cliff Richard would no longer pretend to be the cocky rock star. He would be himself, a believer, a singer, and a man determined to live both roles without apology. It was a gamble. Industry, insiders dismissed him. Music magazines speculated about who would replace him. Booking agents hesitated. But the fans? They stayed. Cliff's decision to live openly as a Christian didn't sink him. It gave him something more powerful than image. It gave him authenticity. He admitted later that before 1966, his rock and roll persona was a mask. He was shy, insecure, always acting. But after embracing faith, he said, my confidence grew. My attitude changed. The pressure to play a role disappeared. I felt free to be real. That honesty carried into his performances. While others strained to keep up with trends, Cliff sounded stronger, more relaxed, more himself. And perhaps most importantly, he became a pioneer. No major UK pop star had ever been openly Christian while staying in the charts. Cliff proved it was possible. His ballads now carried sincerity that audiences believed. His stage presence became warmer, less about rebellion and more about connection. But while faith gave him confidence, the music industry is unforgiving. By the mid-1970s, tastes were changing again. Glam rock, disco, and hard rock dominated the airwaves. Cliff Richard's clean-cut image and gentle sincerity seemed outdated. For the first time since the 1950s, his career faltered. In 1975, he didn't land a single hit in the UK charts. Critics wrote him off as a relic of a bygone era. It looked like the end. But Cliff Richard had already reinvented himself once, and he was about to do it again. This time, not with soft ballads or summer movies, but with a song so dark and unexpected that it shocked even his oldest fans. A song that would drag him back to the top, kicking down the door of the rock world that had once dismissed him. The song's name was Devil Woman. By the mid-1970s, the glow of Cliff Richard's superstardom was starting to dim. Britain's music scene had moved on. Glam rock stomped across stages with glitter and theatrics. Hard rock thundered from Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, and Deep Purple. And on the softer side, ABBA and disco fever were redefining pop. Cliff, with his wholesome charm and faith-driven image, looked dangerously out of place. For the first time since his teenage breakthrough, the charts no longer welcomed him. In 1975, a grim milestone hit. Cliff Richard did not have a single record in the UK charts. It was unthinkable. For 2 decades, he had been a fixture, always present in some form. Now journalists called him outdated. Whispers spread that his career was over. Even Cliff himself wondered if maybe the critics were right. But something inside him refused to quit. Reinvention had saved him before, and he was ready to gamble again. In 1976, Cliff returned with a single that stunned everyone. It wasn't soft, it wasn't sentimental. It was a dark, mysterious track called Devil Woman. The song told a strange story of a man lured by a psychic woman, cursed by a stray cat, and trapped under a spell. It was unlike anything Cliff had ever released. The production was sharp, edgy, almost sinister. His voice carried a grit that listeners hadn't heard before. It was as though Cliff Richard had shed his clean-cut skin and emerged with a new identity. Released in April 1976, Devil Woman climbed to number 9 in the UK. More importantly, it stormed into the American charts, hitting number 6 on the Billboard Hot 100, his first US top 10 hit. For an artist often dismissed as too British for America, it was a breakthrough 2 decades in the making. The single sold over 2 million copies worldwide, reintroducing Cliff Richard as more than just a nostalgic figure. He was relevant again. What shocked the industry even more was who embraced the song. Rock royalty, Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin, Eric Clapton, even Elton John, were spotted wearing badges supporting Cliff's comeback album, I'm Nearly Famous. These weren't the clean-cut pop idols of the 1950s. These were guitar gods, and they were giving public respect to a man critics had declared finished. Music journalists, who had once dismissed him, suddenly changed their tone. One even compared I'm Nearly Famous to the best of Marvin Gaye, a stunning reversal of reputation. Cliff Richard, once mocked as safe and outdated, was now hailed as a serious artist. The comeback was more than commercial, it was personal. Cliff proved to himself that he could evolve without abandoning his faith or his core identity. He didn't chase disco. He didn't copy glam. Instead, he carved his own lane, proving adaptability was the key to longevity. And longevity he had. The late 1970s saw Cliff continuing to ride this new wave of credibility. Songs like We Don't Talk Anymore in 1979, a smooth modern pop ballad, went to #1 in the UK and sold millions worldwide. By then, Cliff had not only resurrected his career, he had ensured his place as a permanent fixture in British music history. But comebacks are fragile things. For every hit, there's always the risk of fading again. As the 1980s loomed, Cliff faced another challenge, staying relevant in a decade known for excess, synthesizers, and larger-than-life icons like Michael Jackson and Madonna. Could Cliff Richard, now in his 40s, continue to compete in a world that worshipped youth? The answer would come with another reinvention, not in the form of darkness this time, but with timeless pop that proved Cliff Richard could weather any era. The 1980s were a brutal decade for artists from the 1950s and 60s. Many who had once filled stadiums faded into nostalgia acts, clinging to old hits while younger stars dominated MTV. Cliff Richard could easily have gone that way. He was already in his 40s, and critics again whispered that his time had passed. But once more, Cliff refused to be written off. Instead, he reinvented himself, this time not as a rebel or a rocker, but as a master of timeless pop. The turning point came with the album Always, guaranteed in 1987. Teaming up again with producer Alan Tarney, Cliff crafted a sleek, modern sound that fit the decade without drowning in its cliches. While other artists leaned too heavily on cheesy synths, Cliff kept his production sharp, elegant, and melodic. The result was a record that felt fresh but not desperate. It was music that could stand beside the new wave of the 80s while still sounding unmistakably like Cliff. The gamble worked. Always Guaranteed went platinum, reaching #5 on the UK charts and staying there for 24 weeks. It sold over 1.3 million copies, proving that Cliff Richard wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. Singles like Some People broke into the top 10 and sold over 250,000 copies. For an artist who had been performing for nearly 3 decades, the achievement was staggering. Then came Christmas 1988. While most pop stars avoided holiday singles for fear of being typecast, Cliff leaned into it. He released Mistletoe and Wine, a gentle, faith-filled ballad recorded in the middle of summer with tinsel draped over the studio microphone. At first, even Cliff wondered if it was too sentimental. But when the song hit the airwaves, the reaction was immediate. The single debuted at #7, then shot to #1 the next week, where it stayed for 4 straight weeks. It sold 750,000 copies in just 6 weeks, becoming the biggest UK single of the year, outselling U2, Kylie Minogue, and Phil Collins. By 2024, the track had gone platinum, still earning Cliff 6 figures in royalties annually. It was more than just a Christmas hit, it became a national tradition. Every December, Britain returned to Cliff's voice, reminding everyone that his presence in their lives was constant. If Mistletoe and Wine proved Cliff could dominate the charts, then June 1989 showed he could still dominate the stage. That summer, he headlined Wembley Stadium with a concert called The Event. But this wasn't just another show, it was a spectacle. The first half was a time machine, recreating the 1950s television program Oh Boy that had launched his career. Cliff shared the stage with acts like the Vernon's Girls, the Dallas Boys, and the Kalin Twins. turning Wembley into a living jukebox. The second half was pure modern Cliff, filled with his 80s hits delivered with the confidence of a man who had survived every storm the industry threw at him. Cameras rolled, the concert was filmed, and later released as a live album and TV special. For fans, it wasn't just entertainment, it was history. That same year, the industry finally acknowledged what the public had known for decades. At the 1989 Brit Awards, Cliff Richard received the Outstanding Contribution to Music trophy. But the honor wasn't just ceremonial. Cliff had achieved something no one else had done. Number one hits in 5 straight decades, the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and now the 90s. By then, he had released 100 singles, racked up 65 top 10 hits, and scored 14 number ones. In a world obsessed with the next big thing, Cliff Richard proved that sometimes the biggest thing never truly leaves. He had outlasted trends, survived dismissals, and reinvented himself again and again. But the 1990s would test him in a different way. This time, it wasn't about staying relevant against younger acts. It was about battling an industry that seemed determined to shut him out, no matter how many fans still adored him. By the late 1990s, Cliff Richard had already achieved what no British singer had done before: chart dominance across 5 decades. He had survived Elvis comparisons, outlasted the Beatles, and reinvented himself more times than critics could count. To his millions of fans, Cliff was an institution. But to the music industry, he was becoming something inconvenient. Radio programmers, obsessed with youth culture, began pushing him aside. The breaking point came in 1999 with a song that should have been a moment of triumph. Cliff recorded the Millennium Prayer, a bold single that fused the words of the Lord's Prayer with the tune of Auld Lang Syne. To Cliff, it was a simple idea, a song of faith and hope to welcome the new millennium. To his fans, it was moving, emotional, and perfectly timed for the year 2000 celebrations. But to the BBC and major radio stations, it was unacceptable. Radio 2 flat out refused to playlist the song, dismissing it as irrelevant. Radio 1 had already stopped playing older acts years earlier. Virgin Radio's Chris Evans mocked Cliff publicly, saying he was too old for modern audiences. The industry insisted it wasn't personal, it was about broad appeal. But the same stations still played Tina Turner and Cher, both Cliff's contemporaries. To fans, the double standard was obvious. Cliff himself was stunned. For decades, he had delivered hit after hit. Now, the very broadcasters who had once relied on him were shutting him out. Yet if the industry thought this would silence him, they were mistaken. Because something extraordinary happened. Denied airplay, denied label support, and dismissed by critics, the Millennium Prayer should have vanished quietly. Instead, it caught fire. Cliff's fans mobilized, churches bought copies, loyal supporters purchased multiple versions to drive sales. The song entered the charts in late November 1999 and defied every prediction. On November 28, 1999, the Millennium Prayer hit number 1 in the UK, and it stayed there for 3 straight weeks through December, all without major radio support. It was Cliff's 14th UK number 1, arriving 40 years after his first. For his fans, it wasn't just a hit. It was a protest, a statement to the industry. Cliff Richard could not be erased. The victory wasn't limited to Britain. In Australia and New Zealand, the song climbed to number 2. Across Europe, it cracked the top 20 in multiple countries, with 3 nations awarding it platinum status. Sales were huge. Money, raised from the single-supported children's charities, turning a song the industry tried to bury into a force for good. And yet the bitterness lingered. For Cliff, the success was sweet, but it was also a reminder of how deeply the industry had turned against him. Instead of celebrating one of the most remarkable comebacks in chart history, broadcasters doubled down. The BBC in particular continued to sideline him, a wound Cliff never forgot. Looking back, he admitted that the experience shook him. It wasn't the first time he had faced rejection. Critics had called him finished in the 70s before Devil Woman proved them wrong. But this was different. This wasn't about trends or tastes. This was about age, perception, and prejudice. To Cliff, it felt like betrayal. Still, he refused to let the bitterness win. The Millennium Prayer proved that his connection with the public was unbreakable, even when the gatekeepers shut their doors. For decades, Cliff Richard had built a career on resilience, and now as the new millennium dawned, he had shown that resilience more fiercely than ever. But the next chapter of his life wouldn't be fought on the charts. It would be fought in the heart, and it would involve a love story that never quite happened, one that spanned decades, friendship, and heartbreak. In the public eye, Cliff Richard was the eternal bachelor, the clean-cut star who never married, never had children, and seemed to devote his life solely to music. But behind the scenes, there was one woman who captured his heart, one woman he loved deeply, though the world never knew until much later. That woman was Olivia Newton-John. Their story began in 1971, when Cliff invited a young Australian singer to appear on his television show, It's Cliff Richard. Olivia was just 22, bright-eyed and on the cusp of international stardom. The chemistry between them was instant. Cliff later admitted, "I knew right away she was a friend for life." What he didn't say, at least not then, was that he had fallen in love. At the time, Olivia was already engaged. Her fiancé was none other than Bruce Welch, Cliff's bandmate from the Shadows. The relationship between Bruce and Olivia was complicated, passionate, volatile, and ultimately doomed. Bruce was still married when he began seeing her, and their affair made tabloid headlines. They remained engaged for 5 years but never made it to the altar. All the while, Cliff stood close by, collaborating with Olivia, performing alongside her, and quietly carrying feelings he never confessed. In his 2020 autobiography, he finally revealed the truth. "When I, and many of us, were in love with Olivia, she was engaged to someone else. I lost my chance." The situation was painful, but also revealing. Cliff, ever the gentleman, never betrayed Bruce, never crossed the line. He kept his feelings buried, maintaining a friendship with Olivia that would last more than half a century. He wrote that everyone who knew her eventually fell for her, but for him, the feelings never faded. Their musical partnership became legendary. Together, they delivered unforgettable performances, their voices blending with effortless grace. In 1980, they scored a hit with Suddenly from the film Xanadu. They sang Beatles classics like When I'm 64 on Stage, turning simple duets into moments fans still treasure. Their final performance together came in October 2015 during Cliff's 75th birthday concert at the Royal Albert Hall. They sang Suddenly one last time, and the audience could feel the depth of their connection. But beneath the harmonies lay a story of heartbreak. Olivia never became Cliff's partner, at least not in the way he had once hoped. She married others. She built a family, and Cliff, ever private, carried on alone. To the public, he was a bachelor by choice. To those who knew him, the truth was far more complicated. Then came the cruelest twist. Olivia Newton-John's battle with breast cancer spanned 3 decades. She fought bravely, undergoing treatments and setbacks while maintaining her trademark grace and optimism. Cliff never abandoned her. He called, visited, and sang with her whenever he could. Just 3 weeks before her death, Cliff spoke to her on the phone. She was upbeat, cheerful, warm, her usual self. "Good day, Cliff." "How are you, darling?" she said. She didn't sound like someone at death's door. On August 8, 2022, Olivia Newton-John passed away at the age of 73. For Cliff, the loss was devastating. In interviews, he struggled with the word death, preferring instead to say she had simply stopped living. It was his way of softening the finality, of coping with the silence she left behind. In 2023, when Cliff released his album Cliff with Strings, My Kind of Life, he included the live recording of their final duet as a tribute. It wasn't just music, it was memory. For him, Olivia wasn't just a collaborator or a friend. She was the great love that slipped away. Cliff Richard may never have married, but his heart was never truly empty. For more than 50 years, a part of it belonged to Olivia Newton-John. And when she left this world, Cliff carried the weight of a love story that was both beautiful and unfinished. But just 2 years before Olivia's passing, Cliff himself faced a trial unlike anything he had endured before. A nightmare that dragged his name through mud, tested his faith, and nearly broke him completely. It wasn't a failed love or a fading chart position. It was something far darker. The year was 2014, and for Cliff Richard, the spotlight was about to become a weapon. On August 14th, 2014, Cliff Richard was relaxing at his villa in Portugal when he turned on the television. What he saw made his blood run cold. Helicopters circled above his Berkshire home. Police officers swarmed through his private belongings. Live cameras broadcast every moment. Cliff Richard, Britain's first rock star, knighted for his contribution to music, was watching his life torn apart on national TV. At first, his mind grasped for explanations. They look like burglars, he thought. But this wasn't a robbery. This was a full-scale police raid, and it had been leaked in advance. The BBC, tipped off by South Yorkshire police, had called the operation the money shot in their internal notes. They wanted drama. They got it. But Cliff Richard, 77 years old, got humiliation. The allegation was devastating. A man in his 40s claimed that nearly 3 decades earlier, Cliff had assaulted him during a Billy Graham rally at Bramall Lane Stadium in Sheffield, 1985. It was the kind of charge that grabs headlines instantly, no matter how flimsy. And in this case, it was flimsy indeed. The accuser described a room filled with sports equipment where the alleged assault had occurred. But investigators quickly discovered the room hadn't even existed in 1985. The equipment he described was stored elsewhere entirely. Even so, the police pressed forward. For 22 months, Cliff lived under the shadow of suspicion. Statements from officers who had guarded him at the rally, officers who confirmed they had been at his side the entire time, were ignored. The investigation cost taxpayers £800,000. And in the end, it produced nothing. No charges, no evidence, nothing. But the damage was done. The live raid footage was broadcast worldwide. Cliff later said that during his court testimony, he broke down as he read out the list of countries that had aired images of his private life being invaded. He described feeling like he might have a stroke or a heart attack from the stress. The toll on his health was brutal. He lost weight. He developed shingles. He couldn't sleep. Some days he couldn't lift his arms. He said his own home felt contaminated, unsafe. He slipped into depression. For the man who had once filled Wembley Stadium with joy, even walking outside became terrifying. And then, as if the humiliation wasn't enough, someone tried to exploit it further. In the weeks following the raid, a man attempted to blackmail Cliff, threatening to spread lies unless he was paid off. The blackmailer was arrested. Yet bizarrely, the original accusation was still treated seriously by investigators. The BBC only deepened the wound. While Cliff remained under investigation, they submitted their live raid coverage for Scoop of the Year, as though destroying a man's reputation was something to celebrate. The court later called that decision arrogant and humiliating, awarding Cliff an extra £20,000 in aggravated damages on top of the eventual settlement. In July 2018, Cliff Richard finally won his case against the BBC. The judge ruled that he had a reasonable expectation of privacy and that the broadcaster had violated it in a sensationalist way. South Yorkshire police admitted their conduct had been unlawful and paid £400,000 in damages. The BBC eventually spent nearly £2 million in legal costs and damages, but no amount of money could erase what Cliff called the smear. The Crown Prosecution Service said there was insufficient evidence to charge him. Cliff demanded stronger wording. There was no evidence, not a shred. Yet the careful legal phrasing left a shadow and implied what if that he believed would haunt him forever. In Parliament, he told MPs that being named publicly had changed him. He said he no longer looked people in the eye the same way, that even though he had been cleared, the damage was permanent. "I feel I've been smeared," he said. And in many ways he was right. His name, his legacy, his reputation, decades of work had been reduced to a headline, a raid in a rumor. For Cliff Richard, the 2014 raid was worse than any chart slump, worse than any industry betrayal. It was a crucifixion in the court of public opinion. And though he survived it, the scars would remain. But if the raid nearly destroyed him, the years that followed revealed something remarkable. Cliff Richard had one more fight left, this time not for chart positions or awards, but for his very survival. When the dust of the 2014 raid finally settled, Cliff Richard was left with two things: vindication in the courts and scars that no settlement could erase. He had been cleared. He had won. Yet he admitted privately that victory felt hollow. He would never get back the nearly 2 years lost to suspicion, the nights spent sleepless, or the way people now looked at him. He said simply, "I'll always feel I've been smeared." Still, Cliff was not a man to vanish completely. Instead, he redirected his energy into survival and into changing the rules so that no one else would endure what he had. The ruling in his case against the BBC became a landmark, tightening the way British media could report police investigations. For the first time, a high-profile celebrity had pushed back against the tabloid culture and won. It was more than a personal victory. It was a shift in the balance between press freedom and individual rights. Even so, Cliff himself withdrew from the constant glare. The man who had once courted television cameras now treated them with caution. He spent more time in Portugal, more time in Barbados, surrounding himself with friends who never doubted him. And yet, even in this quieter life, he never abandoned music. Recording became less about chasing charts and more about creating moments. Albums like Rise Up in 2018 and Cliff with Strings, My Kind of Life in 2023, reminded the world that his voice, remarkably intact after 6 decades, was still there, and the numbers still astonish. Cliff Richard has sold over 250 million records worldwide. He has scored 14 UK #1 singles, more than anyone except Elvis and the Beatles. He has achieved top 10 hits in every decade, from the 1950s through the 2000s. No other British solo artist has matched his span. At the Brit Awards, in 1989, he was honored for his outstanding contribution to music. By the time he turned 80, he had been knighted, celebrated, and immortalized. But numbers alone don't tell the whole story. Cliff's career is defined not just by sales, but by survival. Again and again, he was written off, by critics in the 70s, by radio in the 90s, and by scandal in the 2000s. Each time he found a way back, sometimes with a new sound, sometimes with the loyalty of fans who refused to let him go. He became a living example of resilience, proof that fame is not just about talent, but about endurance. Yet even with all the accolades, Cliff's story carries a shadow. He never married, never had children, and admitted more than once that loneliness was his constant companion. His unspoken love for Olivia Newton-John, his bachelorhood, and his deeply private nature left fans wondering what price he paid for choosing music over everything else. And when the raid of 2014 cast him as a villain in front of millions, the shadow only deepened. Still, those who know Cliff say his faith carried him through. It was the same faith that shocked fans in 1966, the same conviction that led him to stand beside Billy Graham, the same belief that anchored him during sleepless nights after the raid. He often says that his confidence as a performer, his ability to endure storms, and his refusal to disappear are rooted in that inner certainty. So where does that leave his legacy? On one hand, Cliff Richard is Britain's first rock star, the man who opened the door for the Beatles and the Stones. On the other, he is a survivor scarred by betrayal, by the industry, by broadcasters, and by a justice system that lets suspicion linger. His life is a paradox, dazzling triumphs shadowed by painful silences. And yet, when fans gather each Christmas and hear Mistletoe and Wine, or when they replay Move It and remember the teenage chaos of 1958, Cliff Richard is not just a name in history. He is alive, present, woven into the soundtrack of Britain itself. Cliff once said, "I may vanish from the spotlight, but I'll never vanish from the music." And in that, he was right. Because even after everything, the heartbreaks, the betrayals, the raid, Cliff Richard endures.